In 1792, they sailed the ocean blue and found Vancouver. Valdez, Galliano, Captain Vancouver all staked their claim and said, we found it, discovered it, and it was a snowball effect from there. The trees were massive, the fish were huge, and everything was plentiful. We, for thousands of years, as a family, collectively maintained and were authorities over our territory. We had protocols, harvesting protocols, resources. We understood that if we took something, we needed to leave some for the future generations, our future family, the next season, the next run, and that it was a continuing cycle of we only take what's needed and only put in what's necessary. That was changed from contact to colonization to Canadian Constitution, the Indian Act, residential school, reserve systems, and it just kept on going to the point where we weren't people, we weren't allowed to say things, and we needed permission for everything and anything. So 150 plus years ago, we had full say, full authority over our territory, our home, our resources, our everything. And the moment that we weren't able to have our say, the moment that everything started to be stripped away from us, everything went sideways. We no longer have forests. We no longer have fisheries. Shellfish harvesting is closed in the 70s, before my lifetime. And that's what my family lived off of. For all those reasons, it's important for Tsleil-Waututh and my family to have an opportunity to have a say about what's going on in development, in planning, in anything, because of the last 150 years of not being able to say anything.
In my mind and in my heart, I know my ancestors resided on both sides of the inlet. We have creation stories of our grandmother, our very first grandmother being born out of the saltwater, which is now known as the Burrard Inlet. Our grandfather was transformed from a wolf into our first grandfather. These may sound like mythological stories, but they are ingrained and in our blood as Tsleil-Waututh people. And that connection that we have to both sides of the inlet are still very much alive. Our territory is much larger than the dotted lines that they called the reserved lands for the Indians.
When our people first met the migrants coming to our territory, we didn't rebut them. We didn't send them away. We didn't kill them. We accepted them with open arms and said, come, we will share with you. And little do we understand, their colonial mentality of ownership was much different than ours. Their understanding of sharing was much different than ours. But now, as Mother Earth is now trying to rekindle itself, that people in Greater Vancouver are realizing that we need to work together as a family to rebuild this.
To me, I don't see the city of Burnaby as the city of Burnaby. I see it as sacred land. I see it as the home of our ancestors. When I drive through the city, I think of where our hunting grounds used to be, where we used to gather, what type of plant medicines used to grow in these different places, and then thinking about the stories from my families. I see it as this ancient place. Our people are still here. I mean, it's 2021. I'm a Musqueam woman. I still practice my culture. I still speak Hunkaminam. I'm still with my baby on the river shore. How can we raise awareness of being visible within the city is reaching out to the people from the communities and just putting more things out, like the signs in the park and the plaques on the rock, changing that history.
How do we share these stories, and how do we make sure that people are more aware of what our local histories are and really bringing our stories to the forefront? And how do we continue just creating more visibility, whether it's in schools or public places, like places that just want to listen to elders or to our educators or different people in our community, that it really does go a long way, where there's been so many decades and generations where people just were not listened to. So for that time to be here today, it's a large, really positive impact on us.
It's creating space to tell our story, to tell our truth, and invite people in to learn about it, not, bang them over the head and, try and make them feel guilty about being part of a settler system, which, I understand, but I remember going to university, taking a lot of women's studies classes, and one of the women in the classroom said, that she feels guilty. And the professor, in her wisdom, said, well, it's okay to feel that way, but don't let it paralyze you. So understand what the situation is, learn about it, and then find a way that you can help to be a part of unwinding it. Yeah.
As a residential school survivor, third generation, my mom and my grandmother, grandfather went. And of course, every generation it was slightly different, but the whole purpose of the residential schools wasn't about educating our people, or myself for that matter. It was to colonize, it was to assimilate, and our people resisted, and I'm really proud of that. We're coming out of an era where my granddaughter never went to residential school, yet there's parts of her that when she sees the children who didn't return home, it hurts her to this day. And that's the part where I really believe that having a conversation about that and sharing the experiences and the knowledge, it's only gonna bring us that much more closer to reconciliation. So there's the truth, there's the reconciliation, and there's a bridge. And that's what's going to help not only my generation, my children, and my granddaughter, but even future generations as we talk about 7 generations from now.
The city of Burnaby is an important part of our traditional territory. And just to really be open and to understand, there's no wrong questions. There's no reason to feel that you should be ashamed that you don't know about the history. This is why it took us 150 years to get to where we are. That Musqueam wants to share who we are. We think it's an important part of that relationship building, and it's going to be very important to create that relationship so that our children and our children's children will be able to have something to stand upon when we leave.
I think throughout many different cities in the Lower Mainland, we're starting to see things like the highway signage, or at the Waviar Airport, weavings, carvings, murals, for example, too. It might seem like a small thing to learn to say a nation or a language properly, but I think it does make an impact. So if people are not having to correct all the time, or they want to truly learn, how do you say Sgsmå or Hunkaminam?
Kwikwetlem is actually a translation from Hunkaminam dialect, which goes to redfish up the river. And the story of the redfish is a small red sockeye salmon that used to come in abundance, and it used to be a return sockeye of the springtime season as opposed to mid or late summer. There was such an abundance of fish at that time. Up to the late 1800s, it'd be almost like riverbank to riverbank of just fish going through there, and it would almost seem like a person could hop off one bank there and walk across the backs of the fish to the other side. It's a forever changing world now, and it's getting really a lot harder on ecosystems and everything like that. And these are what I want people to know, a little bit more about. Collectively, we have traversed these lands for hundreds of generations, have taken care of it as being original stewards.
I was taught as a young boy that we would go into the forest, and my mother and my other relatives would say, if you're going to pick this medicine, don't be lazy, don't pick the first one. Go further into the forest to make sure that there's more, because you want to make sure that it's not the last one ever. I look at that, and that's part of the makeup of who I am. Then I look at the fishing industry, and I was a key witness on the Sparrow case. And my evidence was based on all of the old people remembering that you took only enough to feed your family and that you left the rest so that there would be more for tomorrow.
We're coming together to understand that Western ways of knowing, Western science is important, but that doesn't mean it's better than or more than Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science and Indigenous ways of knowing. We've got to find a way to weave it together.
And how do we work together and live together? It's a new way of life and a new understanding of growth, development, and cohabitating within each other. But there is a lot that I think needs to be considered environmentally, planning-wise, archaeology-wise, development-wise. And it's not that I specifically or my family wants to stop development, is that there's precautions, laws, and considerations still in place that help me and my family protect our heritage, our knowledge, and our culture from being destroyed.
What's important is acknowledging the truths, acknowledging the history and the truth of the history of our peoples in this territory, because you can't reconcile a relationship when the truth hasn't been told of what you're reconciling. The hurts that have happened.
Reconciliation to me, I prefer to substitute it with a reconciliation. So not just words and, a bunch of fluff, but just to really just, actually be active and proactive.
How do we see, longhouses being built in an urban setting? Or how do we see fishing or berry picking being create that space where we're bringing those old ways back? We have our aspects about educating the public about our histories, but then also having space that we can just do things for our own community that's not only for tourism or showing or presenting to people, but having space within the cities or within our natural part of our territory to do our own work for our cultural ways as well.
We have ways that we could, bring our teachings into city planning, into developing, parks and places and buildings, and, how could we benefit from the construction and let the rainwater flow through the building and return back to the land? How could we incorporate those things, and how can we make green spaces that, sustain the land and the teachings and keep it for future generations? Those are the kinds of things that we need to look at, the city needs to look at when raising awareness of the land and the people of the land. That's the only way that we can grow, and be of one in this city and on this traditional territory, is hearing each other and speaking each other's stories together.
Everything is starting to come together, and in our words we talk about one heart, one mind, one spirit, not coming together in a good way, and I really see that happening, and it's growing each day.
The relationship has become much better, just like with most municipalities in Musqueam's traditional territory. There's a recognition that we're all going to be here moving forward, and we need to build those bridges, create those relationships that are going to strengthen not only the First Nations, the local Indigenous groups, but also the cities as they grow. If we don't have those strong relationships, the city and the communities will not prosper as well as we want them to.
It's all about getting out there and trying to know, the neighbors, in the different cultural groups, and and especially with First Nations being, the first peoples of the land, to bear that in mind and to just try and be, a good ally and, help and, and be a good steward, and, somebody that's coming over from a different country or something, just to be helpful and creating awareness and education. Yeah, just treat it all with the greatest amount of respect.
So our Tsleil-Waututh, our sacred obligation is to this place. And I think that's what people need to understand, that I know you're not going anywhere. Well, hey, I'm not going anywhere. Let's work together.